They had it all, money and fame.
He was making $600 or $700 a year. She was a darling of the press.
And her murder made headlines.
They just blood all over the place.
She put up quite a struggle.
The vicious attack leaves a bloody trail, but where will it end?
He pursued her. He was surveilling her.
They were going to extremes to prevent anyone from knowing where they were.
We had a much bigger crime than what we thought.
Sarasota, Florida, November 7th, 1997. It's a sunny autumn day in the wealthy seaside town that's home to many snowbirds and retirees. But at 4:20 that Friday afternoon, the city's 911 dispatch center receives a distressing call.
This is the 911 center. What's the matter? Mom. Oh my God. My mom is dead.
Okay, what makes you think that?
There's blood all over the place.
Okay, who else is in the house there?
I have my brothers and sisters.
How old are you?
I'm 13.
This is a teenage girl who's just gotten home from school, and she finds her mother on the kitchen floor, dead.
The daughter had come home from school, and the brothers and sister were wandering around crying, and she found her mother.
Is the person that did this to her still there?
Oh, I don't think
so. Okay. Calm down. We have help on the way.
I was dispatched as the primary unit to respond to the house. And it took me a few minutes to get there, but I ended up going in first.
Inside, police find 13-year-old Stevie Bellish in the kitchen.
She was standing over her mother, who was on the floor. Obvious blood, gunshot wound to the face. She'd been there for a little while. There's definitely no signs of life.
4 small children, bloody and distraught, but apparently unhurt, are also in the room.
First thing that we want to do is clear the residence. I had Stevie go outside and start bringing her siblings outside.
Once the children are outside, police clear the rest of the house.
I started going room to room, making sure that there was no other victims or any of the suspects. Looking under the beds, just looking for anybody that's there to do harm or other victims. Unfortunately, there was none.
The scene secured. Paramedics rush into the kitchen.
Scenes like this, it's pretty tough to forget. It is readily apparent that there was nothing that we were going to be able to do for her.
Stevie Bellish identifies the victim as her mother, 35-year-old Sheila Bellish. Sheila Lee Walsh was born in 1962 in Topeka, Kansas, to an Air Force pilot father and stay-at-home mom.
She lost her father when she was 10. He was shot down in a mission in Vietnam. Sheila's father was more than a role model to her. He was her hero, and she wanted to make him proud. She graduated high school in 1982 and started a job as a receptionist at a local law firm, and that's where she met her future husband, Alan Van Hout. It was kind of a whirlwind romance. He proposed to her on their 3rd date, and 3 months later they were married.
Alan soon became a successful businessman, the owner of a medical supply company in Bend, Oregon.
He had made a lot of money. I believe he was making $600 or $700 a year on that medical equipment business.
Now multi-millionaires, the couple relocated to Hawaii and then to San Antonio, Texas.
Alan actually told me, man, one of the most beautiful times he had was living in Hawaii for 2 years. He actually owned a yacht. He said Hawaii is very expensive, but he loved it. That's like the best place in the world to live.
Somewhere in that same time frame, he changed his name to Alan Blackthorne.
He was just like a playboy. He got money, I think he might have had a 911 Porsche.
In the mid-1980s, the playboy became a family man. He and Sheila had 2 daughters, but the marriage didn't last.
Everything seemed like it was wonderful until kids come, a lot of stress come, a lot of different moves people make, they not going in the same direction. I mean, hey, that's why things get dissolved.
There had been a divorce, there had been litigation, there had been child support issues.
Sheila eventually received full custody of her 2 daughters. And in 1992, the single mom fell in love with a pharmaceutical salesman named Jamie Bellish. A year later, the couple married.
They really wanted the family. They had some difficulty getting pregnant, so they decided to try IVF treatment, and it ended up working a little too well.
In December 1995, Sheila gave birth to 3 sons and a daughter, and local media dubbed her the Quad Mom.
When she gave birth to the quads, it was a big media event here in San Antonio.
She was kind of a celebrity.
She was a darling of the press. It made a lot of news.
In 1997, the family of 8 relocated to Sarasota, Florida to start a new life.
He got a promotion in the Sarasota, Florida area, and they packed up and moved.
But for Sheila Bellish, it was the beginning of the end. On November 7th, just 6 weeks after leaving Texas, the 35-year-old mother of 6 is found dead in her home, surrounded by her 4 youngest children.
None of them appeared injured, but they did have some blood on them. There was blood on their feet, it was on their hands. Some of them, I recall, it was on their the life vests that they were wearing.
We wondered why the children were in life jackets. It did look like they might have been out by the pool at some point, but we didn't know when or what time that might have occurred. It doesn't appear from the blood spatter that the children were close when this happened. It appears more like the children came to find their mother and were walking around her after she had passed.
Investigators want to know who could do something as horrible as killing a mother while her young children are in the house.
What's the motive? What is the possible motive for anyone to do what they did to her?
Coming up, police take a closer look at Sheila and Jamie's marriage.
Typically, when you have any kind of homicide, you always start with the inner circle, which would be her current husband.
On November 7th, 1997, police find mother of 6, Sheila Bellish, murdered inside her Florida home. The brutality of the crime shocks even the most seasoned investigators.
This was clearly a homicide. She had her throat cut, had a bullet hole in her cheek.
She had some defensive wounds on her hands and arms.
She put up quite a struggle, and to me, that's a mother's instinct. She had those kids there with her, and she was thinking of her kids.
The trail of blood leading from the kitchen suggests the attack started elsewhere.
Despite severe and ultimately lethal wounds, she actually crawled down a hallway from a utility room.
From where the initial attack had taken place to where Sheila eventually passed away, it was approximately 17 feet.
There were blood splatter marks on the baseboard and somewhat up the wall, every few feet. What was happening was she was crawling to get to the phone, and she was collapsing. She'd lost so much blood and was losing blood. She'd collapse every foot or so, and she'd smack on the floor, and it would throw blood up on the wall.
She'd managed to get to the phone and get it off the receiver, off the hook, but she was never able to dial 911. It was an old rotary phone, so anybody who remembers the old rotary phones knows that dialing the 9 is the longest time it takes to dial. And I always did wonder if it had been a push-button phone, if she might have been able to at least get 911 pressed.
Investigators find no sign of forced entry, but the door between the utility room and the garage is open.
It's believed that that door had been unlocked.
In the utility room off the garage, evidence techs find a bloody knife on the floor.
It appeared to be a match to a set of knives that was located in the kitchen on a magnetic rack. The knife had approximately a 7-inch blade.
Investigators also find a .45 caliber shell casing and a bullet hole in the wall.
The shell casing was located in the utility room on top of the washer and dryer.
Since it appears to be where the shooting occurred, crime scene investigators pay special attention to the utility room when processing the house for clues.
We knew for a fact that the suspect had been in those areas. And we did develop a fingerprint on the side of the dryer. They all get submitted to the latent print division of the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office.
But the results will take time.
In 1997, we were doing most of our latent print comparison manually, which meant a human would sit there and do a one-to-one comparison. So it's impossible to just go through the fingerprint files and start doing comparisons like they do now.
Police are also canvassing the neighborhood looking for additional leads.
The neighborhood they lived in was a quiet neighborhood. Most people were retired. Back then, we probably had 5 or 6 homicides a year in Sarasota County. But it wasn't something that would happen in that neighborhood ever. So when it did happen, people were like, everybody talked about it.
Several witnesses did report having seen a man walk around in camouflage clothing and combat boots in the neighborhood, which they seemed to think was unusual.
Finally, investigators turn to Sheila's daughter, Stevie, but the distraught teen has little to give them.
She was the first one to arrive home from school, and she saw her mother laying on the floor, and she made the 911 call.
After talking to a shaken Stevie, investigators turn their attention to the teen's stepfather, who they'll need to eliminate as a suspect.
Typically, when you have any kind of homicide, you always start with the inner circle and work your way outward. So we initially had to start with her current husband, which is Jamie Bellish. And we looked into where he was that day.
He was interviewed by some sheriff's deputies in Sarasota. He was absolutely heartbroken and devastated.
He told us where he was. He was a salesman for pharmaceuticals, so he had different places that he had been that day.
Jamie said he left the house around 7:30 a.m. He stopped and had breakfast, and then he went to Fort Myers to meet with some clients. He left there around 3 p.m., went to meet with a contractor who was working on the new house.
We were able to later, shortly thereafter, verify everywhere he was.
They quickly concluded he had no involvement in it.
However, when investigators ask who might have reason to hurt Sheila, Jamie Bellish suggests that her ex, Alan Blackthorne, might have something to do with Sheila's death.
They had a very rocky marriage. She filed for divorce. He very much resented it, and they fought constantly for at least 10 years.
Jamie says it got so bad that they decided to move away from Texas.
She wanted to get out of Texas because he was always taking her in and out of court, trying to get custody of the kids, and she had about enough of it. So she left Texas and didn't let him know where she was.
I think it was only Sheila's sister that knew where she was, and 1 or 2 very close friends who fully understood that they were not to tell anyone.
Coming up, did the family's disappearance push Alan Blackthorne over the edge?
He had lost, and it became clear that Mr. Blackthorne hated to lose.
In Sarasota, Florida, police investigating the murder of Sheila Bellish have identified a possible suspect, her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne.
They had been fighting back and forth for, could be close to a decade, from the time of the divorce until 1997. And he would file motions for custody or to reduce child support, and She would file motions to restrict his ability to visit his children. She would file motions to increase child support. It went on and on and on and on.
In early 1997, Alan Blackthorne abruptly surrendered.
He shows up and tells his lawyer that he wants to abandon all rights to the children. He wants to surrender his parental rights. He signed essentially documents giving up any parental rights to his children. And that was a loss. That was a big loss.
While Sheila and Jamie were happy to finally have full legal custody, the fear that her ex had another plan up his sleeve still kept Sheila up at night.
Sheila was a nervous wreck.
And Alan being a very wealthy guy, and she was afraid of him.
He had lost. As we spoke with witnesses, it became clear that Mr. Blackthorne hated to lose.
Jamie and Sheila had quietly relocated the family to Florida.
Jamie was a pharmaceutical representative, and his company agreed to let him move his territory, and they saw an attorney to learn how to purchase that house without being a matter of public record. They were going almost to extremes to prevent anyone publicly from knowing where they were.
Despite their precautions, had Alan managed to locate his ex-wife?
Police contacted airlines and car rental companies to see if Blackthorne had been in the area recently, but they didn't come up with anything.
Placing him in Florida was a long shot at that point.
Sarasota investigators also reach out to authorities in Texas, who contact Blackthorne at his home in San Antonio on November 8, 1997.
He claims he had nothing to do with Sheila's murder, and he just found out about it on the news. Police said he didn't seem like he was trying to hide anything.
We found pretty soon that he was in Texas and couldn't have committed this crime.
But if Alan Blackthorne didn't kill Sheila, who did? Over the next 24 hours, investigators pieced together a series of clues.
They were canvassing the area, and they found an employee at a gas station who remembered a man coming in and asking for directions. The address that he was asking for was Mark Ridge, which is the neighborhood where Sheila lived. They also spoke with a neighbor who said they saw something strange around 9:15 a.m. on the day Sheila was killed.
There was a guy that happened to see a strange vehicle in the neighborhood.
The driver was a young man wearing camouflage.
This is a retirement community. Why would anybody be wearing camouflage outfit, combat boots in this neighborhood?
The witness doesn't know the stranger's identity, but he may be able to help investigators find the suspicious car.
He was able to actually give us a tag number, which was a huge break. And we did run that tag in Florida and got nothing, but we knew that they had just moved from Texas, and we ran that tag out of Texas, and it came back.
The vehicle is registered to a woman living in La Pryor, Texas, which is a small town just southwest of San Antonio. When police contacted the owner, she said her grandson was the person who primarily used the car, and his name was Jose Del Toro.
After a little digging, detectives learned that Del Toro is a small-time criminal from San Antonio.
He's in a work release program after a theft conviction, but he didn't show up that weekend.
We needed to talk to him, and in the meantime, Texas Rangers had located his vehicle and were sitting on it. We kind of thought there'd be a lot of valuable evidence in the car, but we needed some evidence to get a search warrant.
While Texas Rangers watched Del Toro's car, investigators in Sarasota contact local hotels, searching for evidence he'd been in the area.
They got a hit on the name at a hotel just a few miles away from the crime scene. Guest records show Del Toro stayed there on November 6th, the night before the murder.
He did use his own driver's license for ID.
Then, hoping to place Del Toro at the scene of the crime, investigators request a copy of his fingerprints from authorities in Texas.
The Sarasota County Sheriff's Office completed a one-to-one comparison of the prints from Jose Del Toro to the latent print that was lifted from the utility room, and they determined that it was a match to Jose Del Toro.
When we got that fingerprint hit, that was enough to get us a search warrant. And then when we did a search warrant on his car, we found the murder weapon. We found the receipt for the camouflage clothing that he bought right down the street from the crime scene. So we had a ton of evidence on him.
Coming up, investigators are convinced that they've found Sheila's killer. But they'll soon be wondering, was he acting alone?
When the conspiracy theory came out, then we knew we had a much bigger crime than what we thought.
Investigators in Florida have identified a prime suspect for the murder of Sheila Bellish, a small-time criminal from San Antonio, Texas, named Jose Del Toro.
We had his fingerprints at the crime scene.
Searching Del Toro's car, investigators also found the murder weapon and a receipt for the camouflage clothing witnesses described.
His vehicle was parked outside of one of his girlfriend's house down in San Antonio.
The girlfriend said she didn't know anything about Sheila's murder. She said Del Toro told her he was headed to Miami to make a drug deal. But she said if Del Toro was involved, his cousin Sammy would know about it.
Del Toro is still on the run, but on November 12, 1997, Texas Rangers locate his cousin, Samuel Gonzalez, and bring him in for questioning.
Tell me what you know about this incident.
Supposedly just a beating and nothing about the killing was supposed to be occurred. And up to the point when I heard about that and saw the news and was kind of sad about it and disgusted about it.
Gonzalez tells investigators that his friend Danny Rocha had approached him a few months earlier with a job offer.
That's when the conspiracy theory came out, and then we knew we had a much bigger crime than what we thought.
He told us that he was asked to beat up Sheila, and he said, "I can't hit a woman."
Danny started talking about the money involved and said it could be as much as $10,000. And Sammy said he thought his cousin might be interested. His cousin was Joey Del Toro.
Those two traveled to the Bellish residence in Bernie, Texas. Timing was good for her. She got away.
They looked in the windows, and there was just very little bit of furniture. And so they reported to Rocha that it looked like no one was living there.
Gonzalez says Rocha had reached out to him again on November 5th with a new address for Sheila Bellish in Sarasota, Florida, and that he passed the information along to Del Toro.
Okay, so he's supposed to go down to Florida, punch her, and that's it. All right, what happens next?
Sammy claims that Del Toro came back on November 8th and told him that he had fired a gun at Sheila.
He said he shot her, but he didn't know if he hit her or not, and so I didn't want to hear about it. So.
He said he shot at her, but didn't know if he hit her?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
you mentioned anything about cutting her?
No, he didn't.
According to Gonzalez, killing Sheila wasn't explicitly part of the plan, but that he wasn't surprised it happened.
Danny had asked Joey to beat her up in a way that she was not able to take care of the kids. But he said that the best way to do it, just if you want to use 10 grand, is to kill her.
But when investigators ask Gonzalez if he knows where they can find Del Toro, he tells them that Sheila's killer has already fled to Mexico.
Joey is told by someone who had spoken to his grandmother that the police were looking for him, and he was wanted in connection with the murder of a woman in Sarasota. So he takes a bus to the border and walks across the border, and he's gone.
With Del Toro on the run, Investigators focus on the men who allegedly hired him, and the man they suspect is behind it all, Alan Blackthorne.
Why would Danny Rocha? Why would Sammy Gonzalez? Why would Del Toro put a hit on Sheila in Florida? It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. But if Mr. Blackthorne comes into the picture, it makes all the sense in the world.
Talking to associates of both Alan Blackthorne and Danny Rocha, investigators soon established that there is a connection between the two men.
Alan Blackthorne and Danny Rocha's relationship, everybody knew about it. They were big-ass golf buddies.
Danny Rocha was a very good golfer, not PGA quality, but he was a very good amateur golfer. And he gambled.
He was a golf hustler, and he would play golf with Alan Blackthorne and make a lot of money because he usually would win.
The bets were sometimes $1,000 a hole.
But we needed to get Danny Rocha to get to Alan Blackthorne.
Investigators suspect that Blackthorne had also offered Rocha 10 times that amount to get rid of his ex-wife.
It all came back pointing towards Alan Blackthorne.
Sammy Gonzalez's statement gives the authorities enough evidence to take the golf hustler into custody for conspiracy to commit murder on November 17th.
The Texas Rangers actually went to his house and arrested him, brought him to jail in San Antonio, and then we extradited him back to Sarasota.
Getting him to talk isn't as easy.
I sat in on some of the debriefings of Sammy and Danny, which could be brutally difficult.
We didn't get much from him.
Rocha refuses to flip on Blackthorne, but will the investigation be stalled for long?
November 20th, investigators find out that Del Toro's been arrested in Monterrey, Mexico.
Then we had to try to get him back from Mexico. And that turned into a political circus because at the time, Mexico would not let you extradite anybody out of there if you had a death sentence on the table. Coming up,
with Mexico being a possible dead end, investigators try a different approach and hit a new roadblock.
So I said, "You're going to get life in prison." And he said, "I'll roll the dice."
By mid-December of 1997, 1 month after the brutal murder of Sheila Bellish, authorities believe they are close to unraveling the conspiracy that led to her death. Suspected triggerman Jose Del Toro is in a Mexican jail, awaiting extradition.
All the politicians had to get involved and try to work out those details.
Samuel Gonzalez has already agreed to a plea deal for his role in the plot.
Sammy was just a big teddy bear. I don't think he would even get in a fist fight, so I think he got used in the whole process, to be honest with you. But he did get the best deal because he cooperated.
Alleged middleman Danny Rocha has refused to cooperate, but on December 16th, prosecutors charge him with criminal solicitation to commit capital murder and pressure him to turn on Sheila's ex, Alan Blackthorne, the alleged mastermind behind the murder.
I went to the jail and I interviewed him several times because we really wanted Blackthorne.
Eventually, between the jail interviews and statements Rocha makes to the media, investigators piece together what happened.
Danny was looking for some money, and he had some ideas in his head about how he might be able to start a business or whatever with Mr. Blackthorne. And Mr. Blackthorne started talking about Sheila and started talking about how bad of a person she was, how bad of a parent she was, and verbalizing that he would like to see something happen to her. He'd like to see her beat up, and asking Danny about it.
Danny, in addition to making money, a lot of money, gambling on golf with Blackthorne, was a bookie. So apparently Alan thought that he had connections with unsavory underworld type people, but he really didn't. And so Danny asked Sam Gonzalez if he would get involved in having this ex-wife beaten up.
Before they could do it, Sheila and her family moved to Florida, which just made Alan even angrier.
Alan Blackthorne can't lose. No matter what he has to do, he's going to win. He had the mentality that he's rich and he's not going to lose his kids to anybody.
He hires a private detective to track Sheila down.
When she moved to Florida, he pursued her there. He was surveilling her. He was following her.
As soon as the private detective located Sheila, Blackthorne had gone back to Danny Rocha.
Blackthorne told Rocha that there'll be $50,000 in it if I get my children back. And Danny says she'd have to be hurt pretty badly for you to get the children. And he said, that's fine. That conversation was repeated a couple of times. One time, Blackthorne said to him, look, the best way for them to do this is to kill her and dump her in the ocean or bury her in the woods.
One time, he made a statement. He wanted her thrown to the alligators.
With new marching orders from Blackthorne, Danny Rocha alerted Sammy Gonzalez, who contacted Jose Del Toro and set the whole plan in motion.
Del Toro drove basically straight through to Sarasota. He also, during that time, made dozens of phone calls on his cell phone.
He was a good-looking kid. He had a lot of girlfriends. He was on the phone with one or more of them throughout the trip. So that way we sent a subpoena to whatever cell phone company Del Toro was using for his cell phone. And using repeating towers, we were able to show the entire trip.
After Joey Del Toro butchered Sheila, Danny goes over to Blackthorne's house. And Danny says, yeah, they did it. I need some money to give to Del Toro, and I need $10,000. Blackthorne said, you guys fucked up. Because he had already heard that she had been found in her house. He knew before Rocha got there that Sheila had been killed. And she was found in the kitchen of her house. And he had instructed them to bury her in the woods or dump her in the ocean.
Despite being stiffed by Blackthorne, Rocha refuses to testify in court against his old golfing buddy.
The state of Florida, the Sarasota County District Attorney, was trying to coordinate with the Bexar County, Texas DA to work out a deal. They can't work it out. And his case went to trial.
So I said, you're going to get life in prison. And he said, I'll roll the dice.
When he goes on trial in January of 1999, the jury finds Danny Rocha guilty of first-degree murder. He's sentenced to life in prison.
Danny Rocha got exactly what he deserves. I think he'll die in prison.
However, Rocha's refusal to testify against him means that Alan Blackthorne remains free.
I think his wealth, maybe that gave him a sense of invincibility. He was out there after the murder and on like the evening news once in a while.
Blackthorne was so arrogant, it was irritating or aggravating. And he accused Jamie Bellish of being the cause, if not the actual murderer in the case. And frankly, it pissed us off.
Determined to get Blackthorne, investigators continue working the case. And in July of '99, make a major breakthrough.
Mexico agrees to extradite Del Toro and return him to Florida.
Coming up, with Del Toro's plea, only the alleged mastermind behind the murder remains at large. But will Alan Blackthorne ever face justice?
Sometimes if you got money, you can get away with substantial things.
In July of 1999, Florida authorities have finally apprehended the man who killed Sheila Bellish, 24-year-old Jose Del Toro.
He certainly wasn't a professional. He got into something way over his head.
After pleading guilty to Sheila's murder, Del Toro gives investigators a detailed confession.
What happened is that Jose Del Toro sat in the garage area for a bit until he felt comfortable enough to come into the house.
He was in the house for like an hour watching her, and he said he was getting ready to leave because he didn't want to do it, and she noticed him. When their eyes met, he panicked, and he said it was too late then. He had to go do what he had
to do. Del Toro's confession also implicates the man investigators believe is the mastermind behind Sheila's murder. Her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne.
He talked about how Blackthorne told him what a bad woman she was.
But even with Del Toro's confession, Blackthorne will be difficult to prosecute.
Texas has a code of criminal procedure. You cannot get a conviction based on an accomplice's testimony unless that is corroborated and links the defendant to the crime. And they tried every way they could to find that corroboration, but they were having trouble finding it. As time went on, it became more and more clear that they had a problem doing that, and that they might not ever get a conviction in state court, and that the proper venue for it would be federal court.
Prosecutors down in Texas, federal prosecutors, decided that there was a federal crime, planning a crime across state lines.
On January 4th, 2000, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Western Texas issues an arrest warrant for Alan Blackthorne.
Blackthorne was arrested in the parking lot of his country club.
We put him in the car, advised him of his rights, and then we took him down to the FBI office for being processed.
In June of 2000, Blackthorne finally stands trial for the murder of his ex-wife.
He was very cocky at the trial and was doing interviews with the press every day and thought it was a big joke. And he thought he was going to walk on this thing. But the two federal prosecutors were great, and they did their homework.
The circumstantial evidence in this case was very, very strong. Mr. Blackthorne was a very controlling man. He was a man that was very angry about this divorce. He was very angry about the custody of his children. He was obsessed about it.
She eventually prevailed, moved away. He couldn't control her anymore. And that was a good part of our proof, good meaning large part of our proof at the trial, to demonstrate why he would go to the trouble to have her killed.
Prosecutors also put the other members of the conspiracy on the stand, including Blackthorne's old golfing buddy Danny Rocha, who finally agrees to testify.
They were the witnesses that were going to make or break this case. If they were believed, we had a solid shot at obtaining a conviction and gaining justice. Their information had to be corroborated in state court, but it just had to be believed in federal court.
Will the jury believe them? On July 6th, 2000, they announced their decision.
The jury came back with guilty verdicts to both counts in the indictment.
It's taken almost 3 years, but the man most responsible for Sheila Bellish's death has finally been brought to justice.
But justice is an imperfect thing. Mr. Bellish will never get Sheila back. Sheila's gone forever. The kids had to live through this horrible nightmare.
But then you think about the emotional trauma of 4 children walking around their mother in the blood.
And then poor Stevie, 13 years old, came home from school and found her mother. It's heartbreaking. The damage and heartbreak that he caused all those people.
A tragedy like this is never forgotten. Jamie will never forget it, and the kids will, although they were quite young and won't remember it, they'll know of it, and they'll know what happened to their mother.
She was a great lady and a great mother. A lot of times, people that get murdered have a lot to do with why they got murdered. In this case, she did nothing. She was the most innocent victim you could find.
He was a beloved father working hard to provide for his family.
He was a family man. He was a good guy.
He was a very doting parent. He had settled in as a typical suburban father.
Until a cold-blooded assassin descended on a local gas station.
It was so brutal. It literally was just done with no regard for this man's life.
We had a rather big whodunit.
You got a guy with a hot temper. Who did he piss off?
The investigation would take detectives into the upper echelons of wealthy Ohio society to catch a killer out for revenge.
Are they going to retaliate against me? This is scary.
Saturday, June 16th, 2001. It's a busy weekend in the quiet Midwestern town of Akron, Ohio.
It's a suburban area, really, with these large, sprawling homes, lots of acreage. And, you know, it has its strip malls, it has its suburban communities.
It was Father's Day weekend and quite crowded. There was a lot of traffic.
Then suddenly, a shot rings out amidst the crowd of shoppers.
Emergency. I need immediate help. We have gunshot wound at BJ's Wholesale Club. He's got a gunshot wound to his face. He's bleeding profusely.
Is he conscious?
He barely.
The incident occurred at a warehouse club at their gas station, so a public area. And here you have a person pulling up in a motorcycle and shooting one shot.
It was just like so nonchalant. It wasn't at night. It wasn't sneaky.
There were several people who witnessed it, but the person was wearing a helmet and a mask so that he could not be identified.
The assassin's target is a man sitting alone in an SUV. By the time police arrive, he is already dead. The victim is identified as 44-year-old local businessman, Jeff Zack.
When it went through my mind, I was wondering who would do something like this and hurt his family like this.
Before settling down in Akron, Jeff Zack had grown up in another Rust Belt town, Detroit, Michigan.
Jeff Zack was born in 1957, and from what I understand, he was abandoned by his birth father.
The divorce was very hard on my children. In those years, it was very unusual to get divorced, and it was just very hard.
Jeff Zack was fortunate in that his mother remarried, and he had a stepfather who was apparently quite prominent in his life and took a good deal of interest in him.
He was my firstborn child, my firstborn son. He was very smart, very vivacious, very interesting kid.
Jeff's parents encouraged him to pursue his dreams. So in his early 20s, he decided to leave his hometown behind.
Jeff Zack decided to branch out and see the world. He traveled to Israel. Most people of Jewish ancestry have automatic dual citizenship over there.
He joined the IDF, which is the army for Israel. He wanted to become a pilot, but he didn't quite qualify.
He couldn't become what he wanted to become. He had to join the Air Force and become a paratrooper for the Israeli Air Force. But he learned how to speak Hebrew fluently, plus a lot of Arabic and a lot of other languages.
But after completing his tour of duty, Jeff struggled to settle back into civilian life in the United States.
He had the kind of personality that alienated a lot of people. He could be successful at times, but he had an abrasive attitude.
He was this big, kind of in-your-face type of guy. You know, you didn't want to piss Jeff Zack off.
He was trying to be rich. He did whatever he had to do to survive.
Until one day, Jeff met the woman who would change his life forever.
Bonnie and Jeff met in Arizona in 1986. And they fell madly in love, and they kind of just ran away together. They were quickly married afterwards.
Before long, they had a child together.
Brian was born after a few years, so they were ecstatic, and he has always been the sweetest, most darling child. And they lived in San Diego for a couple of years. And then they decided to move back to Akron. Her parents lived in Akron, and they thought they could do better there and would have family there.
They lived in a single-family dwelling in a nice area called Stowe, which is a suburb of Akron.
When I think about Jeff, I think of him as like a family man, a person I was proud to meet, and he loved his son.
He was a very doting parent. He was very involved in his son's life.
But Jeff would never get the chance to see his son grow up. Now he's been gunned down in cold blood by an unknown assailant, and Akron police want to know why.
He was a great father, and he was a husband. And he was murdered in broad daylight. It just didn't make sense.
Brian was 12 and a half when Jeffrey was murdered. So mean. Right before Father's Day.
I never just couldn't get it, on why, who would do something like this to him.
Coming up, was Jeff Zack the family man he appeared to be?
He liked to talk to women, and sometimes that got him in trouble.
"44-year-old Jeff Zack has been murdered outside a busy shopping center in the suburbs of Akron. As detectives speak to witnesses at the scene, they are stunned by the brazenness of the attack.
Mr. Zack pulled into a gas station, and an individual came up on a motorcycle, stopped, shot Mr. Zack in the face.
He did this during daylight, which is, he had a lot of nerve.
The killer had been careful to cover his tracks. Investigators managed to find only one piece of evidence.
A projectile was found at the scene about 100 yards from the vehicle that Jeff Zack was in. That was a good find, but there was nothing really to compare it with.
And although the shooting occurred in public, no one is able to provide a clear description.
The shooting happened so quickly that no one really had the time to get a good look at the perpetrator.
That person wore dark clothing and a motorcycle helmet with full darkened face mask, so the face couldn't be seen.
However, witnesses did get a good look at the killer's motorcycle.
It was a ninja-style motorcycle. They call them crotch rockets.
It was like a racing motorcycle, one that the witnesses said was built for high speed.
It was one of those bikes that you lay forward on, and it has high horsepower. It was black and white, trimmed in green, like a fluorescent or a candy apple green.
Investigators issue an alert, but without a license plate number, they know the chances of finding it are slim.
Even though this murder took place on Father's Day weekend in a crowded parking lot on a shopping day, the police really didn't have much to go on.
What do you have, really? You have this shadowy figure who pulls in, commits a murder, and drives away. Nothing else.
No one seems to have any idea who might want to kill Jeff, but his wife, Bonnie, is able to give detectives a promising lead.
Shortly before his murder, there was a phone call to the resident indicating that you have one more chance to get out of this. And Bonnie told Jeff about that phone call, and he was very nervous about it.
At the job sites, he would tell me that he was getting a phone call, and I'd be like, Jeff, just don't worry about it. Don't get stressed out. Just let's get the job done. And I never knew it would just end up to the situation that it ended up to.
We recovered that voicemail, and it was basically a veiled threat to Jeff Zack that he had a short time left and that he better do the right thing.
Investigators want to know, who was this mysterious caller?
She holds nothing back. She says, look, my husband, he was involved in some really shady business.
Here was a guy who had a very bad temper, who had business dealings that had gone south, numerous bad business dealings. So this was a guy who made enemies spontaneously.
He was arrogant, abrasive, and when you deal with a victim that's like that, your investigation is going to go into a bunch of different directions. You have to keep an open mind and follow up on everything.
Detectives learned that one of Jeff's bad business deals led to a heated argument in the weeks before his death.
Jeff and Bonnie's house had wind and rain damage to it, and these two independent contractors were going to repair it. Well, they took the money and then they ended up not doing the work, and Jeff was threatening to turn them over for insurance fraud. And there was exchange of words between them. One of the contractors we thought was the one that had threatened him. He remained a suspect up until he took him past the polygraph and was eliminated as a suspect.
When investigators asked friends and family if Jeff had problems with anyone else, one name immediately comes to mind.
He would talk about, this lady. I never knew her, but he would always talk about this certain lady.
Jeff was hardly a monogamous husband. There was a long-time affair with a local woman named Cynthia George.
Cindy George was married to a man who owned a huge restaurant.
I heard of Cynthia George and Ed George because they own Tangiers in Akron, and Tangiers is a pretty prominent place.
They were considered elite in Akron, not the average by any means.
After work, Jeff Zack, he would more or less have reasons to go over there to hang out.
But according to Bonnie, her husband was doing a lot more than just hanging out.
Jeff Zack and Bonnie Zack would be in the Tangiers, and Cynthia would walk by, and just the eye contact alone between them, you could tell there was something going on.
Bonnie was devastated. Cindy pretended to be a good friend of the family and of Jeffrey's. But we all suspected that it was an affair.
Detectives sit down with Bonnie Zack, and they have to empathize with her a little bit. I mean, this woman just lost her husband, the father of her children.
Their affair had also led to other complications.
As Bonnie described the relationship between her late husband and Cynthia George, she disclosed that not only were they lovers, they shared something else in common. They shared a love child. In fact, one of the George's children, who Ed George embraced as his own, was apparently Jeff Zack's offspring.
Coming up, did his wife's infidelity drive Ed George over the edge?
As a jilted husband, he had the motivation to have him taken out.
Detectives in Akron, Ohio have gotten their first lead in the slaying of local businessman Jeff Zack. After speaking with his widow Bonnie, investigators have ruled her out.
They found her to be relatively gracious, relatively honest, did not seem suspicious in any way.
And according to Bonnie, Jeff had been cheating on her with one of the most powerful women in the city, nightclub owner Cynthia George.
In May of 2001, right before the homicide, Bonnie found out about it. Jeff told her that he cut it off.
Could Jeff's killer be his ex-lover or her husband?
Detectives told me that they suspected Ed George as a culprit because he seemed to have a motive. His wife had a child with Jeff Zack. Maybe he felt shame.
As investigators dig deeper into the Georges' marriage, they learn that Ed and Cynthia had always been an odd match.
Cynthia grew up in North Canton, which is south of Akron, and it's kind of a Rust Belt town.
Cynthia George had come from rather humble stock herself. She was the daughter of a coal miner, and the family struggled.
The Georges were wealthier and had the Tangiers restaurant. And I think some of the Georges felt as though Cindy was not good enough for Ed George.
The couple had first met when Cynthia auditioned to become a dancer at the Tangier in 1978. But as soon as Ed laid eyes on her, he had other plans.
Cynthia was Mrs. Ohio runner-up at one time. So here is this beautiful woman kind of gracefully walking throughout this club at night.
She was a strikingly beautiful woman, and Ed was a successful man, and the chemistry seemed to work for them.
Soon they got married. If Cynthia George was looking for a golden ticket, certainly Ed George was it. You know, when investigators look at this, they're like, well, wait a minute. Cynthia George, Ed George, very wealthy, and here's Jeff Zack. He lives in a suburban house. He does not have any money. How does it fit?
After gathering all their information, detectives quite reasonably decided to pay a visit to Cynthia George.
They began asking her questions because she's connected to this victim. You know, she's like, who, me? I've done nothing. I don't know anything.
She did admit that she knew Jeff Zack, but she wouldn't elaborate any more than that.
Cynthia George may not want to talk, but her husband has a lot to say about Jeff Zack.
Ed George wasn't home when investigators first questioned Cynthia. So they go to Ed, and they want to question him. Ed tells this kind of contradictory story to what his wife had told.
He described Jeff Zack as something of a menace. He said that Jeff Zack had been phoning the house, he'd been calling the house and hanging up. To Ed George, he wasn't just a nuisance. Jeff Zack was a harasser.
Now we have two different stories from a married couple who both know the victim. Wow. You got to look further into that.
To find out whether Bonnie Zack's claim about the Georges' child is true, they request a court order for a DNA sample.
Police wanted to confirm whether this tale about Jeff Zack fathering a child with Cynthia George was indeed true. I mean, at this point, you know, they're hearing information from people, but it's basically gossip.
Cynthia and Ed George are very prominent in the community of Akron. So when this did come out regarding Jeff Zack possibly fathering a child with Cynthia, I mean, it was unbelievable. It was just mind-boggling to people.
Ultimately, police were successful in obtaining a court order to force the Georges' child to take a paternity test. When the test results came back, it turned out that biologically she was not Ed Georges' child. She was indeed Jeff Zack's child. At this point, police realized Cynthia George had been carrying around a very weighty secret.
If Ed discovered the truth, it seems plausible that he'd want to take his revenge. But investigators know that isn't the only possibility.
They're thinking, geez, either Cynthia or Ed George could have hired someone to kill Jeff Zack. Or maybe it was Cynthia George herself on that motorcycle who killed Jeff Zack. Maybe it was Ed George.
She had motive for getting rid of Jeff Zack because Now there could be a custody battle, and Ed George had motive, because if he did know, maybe he was so shamed by this scandal that he wanted to get rid of Jeff Zack.
Coming up, a new suspect unexpectedly enters the picture.
Police get a call, and bang, this thing just opens wide.
Several months into the investigation of Jeff Zack's murder, Akron police are looking into millionaire couple Ed and Cynthia George and their relationship with the victim.
Cynthia and Jeff had a relationship for approximately 7 years. They even had a baby together.
However, detectives still have no hard evidence tying either of them to the crime.
Jeff Zack was a pest. He was a harasser. He was the father of one of the George's children. But there was nothing really beyond that.
Because they don't have enough evidence really to charge Cynthia or Ed George. What do? They've taken it as far as they can go.
I thought the investigation just stopped, for some reason. Then everything came out.
On the 1-year anniversary of Jeff Zack's death, the Akron Beacon Journal publishes an article about the case. It leads to the breakthrough investigators were hoping for.
Shortly after the article ran, a tipster phoned the Akron Police Department and said, "I know who the shooter is."
And that tip comes with a name. John Zaffino. John Zaffino is this kind of short, stocky guy, mustache, slick back hair, a wannabe gangster. If you're looking for a profile of a murderer, John Zaffino, he fits it. But here's a question. Why would John Zaffino murder Jeff Zack?
When investigators track down John Zaffino, he refuses to answer any questions. But his ex-wife is more than willing to talk to police.
It was just a cold case for a year. And then Christine Zaffino, who was John Zaffino's former wife, came forth and said she suspected that John Zaffino and Cindy were involved in the killing of Jeff.
He had told her things that made her suspicious. The police were investigating him.
According to Christine, John Zaffino had admitted to her that he had recently had an altercation with Jeff Zack. And she asked him straight out, "Are you the guy who shot him?" And he said something to the effect of, "Well, let's put it this way. He's going to have a hard time parting his hair from now on."
When detectives play the threatening voicemail on Jeff's answering machine, Christine is absolutely certain it's him.
She said, "No doubt about it. That is the voice of my ex-husband, John Zaffino."
If anybody should be able to recognize his voice, it would be ex-wife.
Christine also has a good idea what his motive might have been.
Even though John Zaffino and Christine Todaro had broken up, she kept track of different occurrences in her ex's life. And she knew that he had been dating a woman who was attractive and older and had money.
And they say, "Well, do you know her name?" She says, "Yeah, I know her name. She's very popular in town. Her name's Cynthia George." So where's the common denominator? Where's the connection between John Zaffino and Jeff Zack? Well, the connection was at the Tangiers. Cynthia George.
This was not a love triangle so much as it was a lover's quadrangle. While Cynthia George was married to Ed George, she was having affairs with both Jeff Zack and police determined John Zaffino.
John was kind of a blue-collar guy, and Cindy originally was a blue-collar woman, so maybe there was this attraction there.
How much she really got deep into a relationship with John Zaffino is possibly still a question. But their relationship developed at least significantly.
At this point, Cynthia is refusing to speak with investigators and does not admit to an affair with John. But DMV records provide detectives with another piece of evidence.
They discovered that, lo and behold, a month before Jeff Zach's death, what had John Zaffino purchased? A motorcycle. Now, not just any motorcycle, a black and lime green motorcycle, like the one seen at the crime scene.
My captain, Beth Doherty, found the motorcycle in Pennsylvania on a publication called Cycle Trader. And that's when Mike Schaefer and I were tasked with going to recover it. We located the bike, and we learned that he had transported there at night. He was desperate to get rid of the motorcycle, and that he wanted to trade it for any car that they had on the lot.
It's enough for police to make an arrest. On September 25th, 2002, they take John Zaffino into custody.
One domino has now fallen in this murder case. But investigators know there will be others.
Coming up, did he kill Jeff Zach to keep Cynthia George to himself? Or was he a hired gun?
Investigators are saying, look, was Cynthia involved? Was Ed involved? Did they pay you to do this?
Investigators in Akron, Ohio have arrested one of Cynthia George's lovers, John Zaffino, for the murder of her other lover, Jeff Zach. But they believe there is still more to the story.
We cleared Ed George of any involvement in this, and Cindy remained a suspect, but we didn't know how much until John Zaffino became a suspect. And then the more he became a suspect, the more the involvement of Cindy was believed.
Under interrogation, John tries to deny everything.
John Zaffino says, I'm totally innocent. I had nothing to do with this. In fact, I was at a car show in Pennsylvania the day the murder occurred. So I have an alibi.
People were located that he supposedly was with and interviewed, and they didn't support his alibi as far as timing. He had enough time to do the murder and travel down there and use that as his alibi, but it didn't hold up.
His phone records proved to be even more incriminating.
Then you look at the phone records immediately after the homicide. Who does he call? He calls Cindy George.
John Zaffino talked to Cynthia George just before Jeff Zach was murdered and just after he was murdered. Now, why would he do that? He would do that for two reasons. One, to say, I'm on my way to kill him, and a second time to say, I just killed him.
Prosecutors offer John a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against Cindy, but still, he refuses to talk.
Obviously, we wanted him to cooperate. He did not do that. So there's two inferences to draw, that Cindy wasn't involved or he's loyal to Cindy and was not going to rat her out.
They could tie John Zaffino directly to the motorcycle, and they knew that his alibi was false. And so they said, all right, let's take this guy to trial.
In February of 2003, almost 2 years after the crime, John Zaffino stands trial for the murder of Jeff Zach.
Even though Cynthia George was not on trial herself, the foundation of the case revolved around Cynthia George. Cynthia George was apparently John Zaffino's motive for committing this murder.
What the prosecution presented was that Cynthia had an affair with Jeff Zach. And when it ultimately ended, Jeff Zach kind of couldn't let it go. And he kept trying to contact Cynthia. Cynthia said, this gentleman's harassing me and I would like you to take care of it. And allegedly John did.
They even put Cynthia George herself on the witness stand.
Cynthia was called as a witness to his trial.
She pleads the fifth. Why would you do that? You would do that if you had things to hide. You would do that if you thought what I say is going to get me in trouble.
For the jury, Cynthia's silence is just as incriminating as anything she could have said.
On March 11th, 2003, John Zaffino was found guilty of murder.
He was given life with, I believe, his first opportunity for a parole hearing would be 23 years later.
He's sent away forever on a murder charge. Now, what will that do to John Zaffino?
Still, John refuses to talk.
We were hoping that John Zaffino would testify against Cindy. That just never occurred.
The public sentiment by the end of 2004 was that Cynthia George was the mastermind of this murder. Everybody was talking about that.
It was horrible. And I did some interviews purposely because I wanted it out there that I felt Cindy was involved.
It isn't until the following year that investigators feel they have enough evidence to finally prosecute her.
The big break was that John Zaffino and Cynthia George were talking. There were calls from the prison to her that were recorded. And those calls started to reveal that perhaps there was a conspiracy here to commit murder, that Cynthia was involved. The prosecution believes that Cynthia George was basically paying money to John Zaffino, and John was dangling over her head with this ambiguous threat, if you will, that he was going to drop a dime on her at any moment if she didn't pay.
On January 10th, 2005, Cynthia George is placed under arrest.
Police moved in on Cynthia George as she was shopping. She was arrested very publicly in a very public place.
The reason for it was twofold. One, they wanted to make a statement to the town, to the city, that they never gave up on this case. Number two, they wanted to put fear into Cynthia, to let her know that, listen, you're not above the law.
The police called me to tell me that they had indicted Cindy and that they arrested her, and I was ecstatic.
Coming up, will Cynthia George be convicted, or will wealth and power help get her off the hook for murder?
If you got money, you can buy your way out of most of anything.
More than 4 years after Jeff Zack was killed, Akron millionaire Cynthia George stands trial for conspiracy to commit his murder.
This case attracted a lot of interest in the city of Akron.
This case had everything, really, that the public ate up. Affairs, illegitimate child, wealthy people.
Due to the widespread media coverage, Cynthia's lawyers make a surprising request.
Cindy was afraid that maybe that publicity would have affected the jury.
Rather than being tried by a jury of her peers, she decided to have a bench trial, which meant her fate would be decided by a judge.
The old adage is everybody wants a fair trial as long as it's in their favor.
On November 14th, 2005, prosecutors make their opening arguments before the judge.
The prosecution had some concerns because they didn't have really John Zaffino saying, yeah, she told me to kill him. But what they did have is they had a lot of document evidence, meaning they could show money changing hands.
When authorities accessed the financial records, they discovered that a month or so before the murder, $5,300 had come out of Cynthia George's account. And approximately $5,300 had been used to purchase the motorcycle that was used to kill Jeff Zack.
It was just too coincidental, all of the bank statements that matched what was out of Cynthia's account to the penny.
They also draw attention to the communication between Cynthia George and John Zaffino at the time of the shooting.
Remember the phone calls? The phone call before the murder and the phone call after the murder. Was that a coincidence?
I was very happy because I knew evidence was coming out against her and that she would probably be found guilty.
However, Cynthia never admits to an affair with John, and the defense argues the state's evidence is purely circumstantial.
Even though you could imply that Cynthia George may have been involved in this case, there was no concrete evidence that she was the puppeteer in all this. In fact, it was entirely possible that John Zaffino, who was a bit of a hothead, decided to kill Jeff Zack on his own.
Those records don't prove that Cynthia knew what he was going to use that motorcycle for.
On November 28th, the court reconvenes to hear the judge's decision.
Everybody reassembled in the courtroom. Cynthia George stood up, she faced the judge, and the judge said, "I have rendered my verdict."
She was found guilty. I was very satisfied.
Cynthia George was sentenced to life in prison. You can hear her family wailing in the courtroom, and it's pretty heartbreaking.
Her family became hysterical, but I, of course, was happy. I felt that justice was served.
Cynthia wastes no time in submitting an appeal.
The conviction of Cynthia George was appealed up to the 9th District Court of Appeals, alleging errors occurred at the trial court level, which caused her to be found guilty.
She hired the best appellate lawyers she could get. And, you know, the thing is, it's very, very unlikely that an appellate court would overturn a murder conviction. So she was not facing an uphill battle. She was facing Mount Everest here.
But a year and a half later, she achieves what many believe to be impossible.
On March 21st, 2007, the charges against Cynthia George were dismissed by the Court of Appeals.
That appeal decision just really blew everybody involved in this case away. Really did.
When you read their opinion, they wanted evidence of solicitation and procure. They wanted a conversation from the state where Cynthia George is asking John Zaffino to commit the murder. We did not have that. We had solely circumstantial evidence.
After her release, the George family releases a statement saying their faith had sustained them and that they are moving forward with their lives as a family.
Last I heard, Cynthia George was, living the happy, elite life with her husband and her kids, who are all grown now.
In my eyes, Cynthia George got away with murder.
It's a sentiment shared by many in the city of Akron. Many felt that a woman of wealth and privilege seemed to have taken revenge on a former lover, something Cynthia George has always denied.
Do I think the George's money, status, and standing in the community had anything to do with that verdict being overturned? Hell yeah, I do.
Cindy had the benefit of great attorneys. She got top legal help in this case.
The fact that she got out after 16 months kind of upset me, and I miss them horribly. It was horrible loss. It took a lot of years of pain and anguish. I don't think anybody suffers as much as a mother.